Hey guys, welcome back. In this lesson, we'll be learning more about REST APIs, what they are, and why we use them. A lot of new developers that I've met, they come across this concept of a REST API and they get really confused. They get really baffled by what it is. And to be really honest, it's not that difficult to understand. It's just that the resources that you find on the internet to understand REST APIs are so obscure and difficult to understand, you end up getting really frustrated with the concept itself. If you've ever worked with anything that runs on the cloud, it's basically using an API and most probably using a REST API. So, in extremely simple words, REST API is a representational state transfer based application programming interface. Now, I know you really did not understand a word of what I just said, and to be honest, when I was learning about REST APIs, even I didn't understand what it was and the way that people were explaining. So, what is a REST API? So, let me explain what an API is. And we will use the simple process of going to a bank and encashing a check. So, let's assume you have a check and you need to encash it, you need to withdraw cash from your bank account. So, this dude is you. This is the bank person, the person you see beyond the counter, and this is your bank account. So, you go up to the respondent behind the bank counter and you ask him that you need to encash a check. Then he responds, sure, but he needs the check from you, so you hand over the check to him. Then he goes to your bank account, verifies your signature, confirms your account number, withdraws the cash that you have described in the check, and then comes back to you and hands you over the money. Now, if you were able to understand this example, and if you were able to follow through with this example, then you already know what a REST API is. Now, let me unlock that hidden potential that you have. Now, let's assume a situation where you have a database, you have a REST API, and you have a front end. Now, the bank account in the first example becomes your database. The person behind the counter or the respondent becomes the REST API, and you become the front end. Now, we will take the case of our to-do list application, and in our to-do list application, the most common feature that we have is requesting a list of created to-dos, and to do that, we make a request to the REST API, ask for a list of to-dos. The REST API confirms this request and then moves to a database. It fetches all the to-dos, collects them in a object called JavaScript object notation or JSON, packs them, brings it to you and hands them over. This is basically what an API does. As its name suggests, it is an application programming interface, an interface to program applications. So if you need to contact the backend or the database of the server using a front-end client, you would need a REST API to communicate with the backend. So now that you have hopefully understood what basically a REST API does, we need to really talk about why we need to use REST APIs. A while back, when PHP and all of the and Java and all these languages were popular in web development, we did not have the concept of REST APIs. We had a concept of monolithic applications, which means that the front end and the back end are a part of the same application. So the front end didn't really need to make a request to another application or the REST API to fetch some data. It did that in itself. But there are a few problems with it. And those problems you will realize once I discuss why we need to use REST APIs. The reason we need to use REST APIs is because they are modular in nature, which means they break down your problem into sub-problems, and then you can handle those individual problems in a more focused way. And then this leads to a more maintainable code because your problems have been broken down into smaller problems. If an error arises, you know exactly where the error arising, and then you can mitigate that error. The next reason why we use REST APIs are because the REST APIs separates the backend and the front end, which means that you can have two different teams working on only the backend and only the front end. So they don't really have to meddle with each other's work. There are two different code bases and they can be maintained separately. This is a extremely important feature that REST API has because this promotes the use of different technology stacks for different purposes. For example, if I need to build a REST API separately and a front end separately, computing intensive language such as Java, Python to build REST APIs, but I will use a more suitable front-end language to build the web UI, which is JavaScript. So REST APIs promotes this feature. The next, and according to me the most important feature that REST API brings into your workflow, is that your application can run on any device. If suppose you make a web application, you can fetch a list of to-dos from that web application. If you need to make an Android application, your Android application can make a request to the REST API and fetch a list of to-dos for the Android application. Same for an iOS application. So if you're using a REST API, it allows you to build applications that serve the same backend over different platforms. So you don't need to maintain different code bases for the same backend. This, in my opinion, is the most important feature or benefit of REST APIs. So I hope with this video you were able to understand what REST APIs are and why we need to use them. In the next lesson, we'll be creating a REST API using a framework in Python called Flask. So see you in the next lesson.